Good evening. Thank you for your flexibility in adjusting to my schedule. Let me start by asking who I've got here. Since we're going to talk about education, let me know by raising your hand if you graduated from a public high school. Okay. And keep your hands up. Of those of you who graduated from a public high school, how many felt it prepared you well for Occidental College? Pretty high percentage. Pretty high percentage. Satisfaction. Okay. Let me ask just a couple of other questions. As you think ahead, how many of you would contemplate applying to either Teach for America or teaching in a charter school? Of Ivy graduates would apply. How many are thinking that you would like to someday run for public office? Okay. And if the election were held tomorrow and the Republican candidate was either Romney or Palin or Newt Gingrich against Obama, how many of you would vote Republican? And that's probably an unfair way to ask the question, particularly at Occidental College these days, right? Okay, let's talk about education policy and politics. I want to focus on trying to answer three questions. First of all, we've been talking about the same issues in this country for about 45 years. It has to do with the achievement gap. We didn't call it that in the 60s, but we call it that today, and we've been talking about it pretty continuously as a nation. We've been talking about it in many state governments and setting policies. And the question that I want to get to is, why have we failed so badly at narrowing the achievement gap? Because we have. And when we first started talking about this, it was a black-white achievement gap. Today we talk about it in terms of it being a gap between how well Latino and black students do when compared to how well white and Asian students do. Or sometimes it's how kids from economically disadvantaged homes do compared to middle class and affluent kids. But we've not narrowed that gap very much at all in the last 20 years. We narrowed it noticeably and significantly in the 70s and into the mid-80s in terms of academic performance between black and white students. It plateaued, it hasn't changed much. And we have spent a lot of money. We've appointed a lot of commissions, we've written a lot of laws, we've started a lot of reforms, all directed at trying to solve this problem. It hasn't worked. So why? What can we learn from that? What should President Obama do about it? And in order to get into the politics of it, what stands in the way of getting this done? So real quick, let's talk about the gap. Now, actually, we talk about two gaps in achievement in the United States. I've mentioned the one that receives most of the attention. What's the other one? What's the other achievement gap that we talk about in this country? President Obama's talked about it? Yeah. Us and other nations. Right. Like the gap between how well American students do when compared to students in those countries that are economic competitors. And the only evidence we really have for that, a series of tests given to 9, 13, and 16-year-olds in somewhere between 20 and 30 countries over a number of years. And rather consistently of late, American students, particularly as they get older, do less well against countries like Singapore, Taiwan, Finland. I wanted to get that in. Finland leads frequently. The Netherlands, Japan. things that we want to talk about in terms of Obama's policies bear on that. This gap, we don't have to spend much time on it because we have such overwhelming evidence of the persistence of this gap, or the stubbornness of it. And that it is defined largely, but not exclusively, in terms of social economic status. And the gap is, if you're born into a poor family, you are, and if you're a male, you're only about half as likely to graduate from high school as is a white or Asian male. If you do graduate, you will be achieving in terms of literacy about at the same level as a ninth grade white student. And this is a gap that is something that opens up early and doesn't close. We know from lots of studies that the working vocabulary of 3-year-olds in poor families is much smaller than the working vocabulary of kids in middle-class families. We know that in kindergarten that a much smaller percentage of poor kids know their letters, can identify uppercase B and lowercase d, and can count to 30, and have familiarity with print, with books. By 4th grade, the gap is about 2 years. And again, particularly in terms of, and we have millions of records on this from the National Assessment for Educational Progress, the lack thereof. So this is not something that is disputable. This is something that is enduring. It is something that is received a lot of ineffective attention. So the question that's raised from that is, why are we making such little progress? And I want to offer a few suggestions. I want to provide a little history, because the history helps explain why we are where we are. And I'm not going to give these factors in any particular order, but let me start with one that I think is terribly important and least often discussed. And that is that for most of the last 50 years, 40 years, people in positions of authority and influence have been very timid about talking about the underlying causes of the achievement gap. They are afraid to bring it up. When they do bring it up, they do not discuss it fully, and they do not give the weight it deserves in helping to explain why the achievement gap is so persistent. Secondly, we are talking about a real lack of curiosity being shown by the people responsible for public education. In other words, you have districts where the same pattern has prevailed for decades. And they go on replacing superintendents and principals and supervisors and assistant superintendents as if they keep doing what they did last year, that somehow the results will be different this year, even though the results have been very disappointing year after year after year. But they don't change, and they don't ask themselves, what's going on? What do we need to look at? What do we need to change in order to have a fighting chance to improve the prospects of the kids we're responsible for? So you have a lack of curiosity and I think competence, because they don't have the answer. They're afraid to raise the question in part because they don't know what to do.